Alright guys, so we're going to move forward in our evolution unit, and the next lesson is going to be about macroevolution. So we started off with the micro, which was small scale changes, and as we're moving into macro, we are definitely getting into something that could be a little touchier. Okay, so we're going to be dealing with speciation here, and so with micro, all we saw were just small changes to the allele frequencies. You know, certain alleles could increase or decrease over time, or certain traits or certain ends of the spectrum could be favored, or we could see shifts along a continuum. But with macroevolution, we're going to see the introduction of new species. And so we're going to have to understand, first of all, what in the world is a species. And so by definition, because there's different definitions out there, but for your biological species definition, it's going to be a population or group where they are able to breed and produce offspring that can have babies. Okay, so this is going to be key. So number one, they have to be able to breed. They have to be able to mate. Number two, they have to be able to produce offspring. And then number three, those offspring have to be fertile, because in biology, it's all about carrying on that line and, you know, moving those genes from one generation to the next. So in order to be considered a species, they are an interbreeding group that can produce reproductively capable offspring. And so when we look at a species, they are going to be the most alike in terms of their DNA. They're going to have the closest chromosomal alignment. They're going to have similar characteristics on the inside. They're going to have similar characteristics on the outside. And now, it doesn't mean they're going to be exactly the same. Remember, we're going to have variation. But they are going to have the highest level of DNA alignment, which means they're going to have the most similarities amongst their DNA. And so when it comes to speciation, in order for that to happen, there has to come a point where either two groups within a species either won't mate or they can't mate and produce viable offspring. And so one of the things I do want to clarify on is a lot of times when people think of speciation, they want to think that something is turning into something new, and that's not the case. Okay, speciation is just where two groups will no longer breed, and so we would then consider them to be two new species. So like Darwin's finches, for example, they were all finches. But when they became isolated in a way that they would no longer interbreed, then that is the point at which we call them their own species. So they're still birds, they're still finches, but if they're not reproducing with the other groups, then they now have become their own species. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we're creating something brand new and different. It just means we've reached a point where that mating and production of viable offspring no longer occurs. And so we have two general categories of speciation. We have allopatric and sympatric. Now, allopatric is due to geographic isolation. So in order for allopatric to happen, there has to be some kind of physical barrier or some kind of physical separation between the two. So this could be due to something like continental drift, where as the continent shifted, they were now on different land masses. It could be the sea level changes and it covers up a block of land, and so once again we have isolation, climate change, some kind of geologic change in the earth that could separate them. So I've heard of an example of a particular squirrel group that in the Grand Canyon area, where it gets to a point where if they're divided on either side of the canyon, they are no longer going to mate, and so over time they become their own species. And so the key to allopatric is there is a physical or geographic isolation. There's a separation between the two. And so what happens is those alleles are no longer flowing amongst the two, and over time they become their own species. Now the other type is sympatric, and sympatric is anything other than geographic isolation. So it could be some kind of behavioral thing, it could be some kind of a resource partitioning, something's going to happen. It could be an example of disruptive selection, where maybe you have the extremes favored, and over time they kind of become their own species. They tend to mate within their own extreme group. And so what can happen is we have speciation, but it's not because they were physically isolated. So allopatric is you have a geographic isolation. Sympatric is anything other than that. And so sympatric speciation can actually happen pretty quickly. It doesn't necessarily take generations. And so a lot of times this is just simply due to a chromosomal error. Now this is not something we really see going on with animals, because in most animals this is lethal. But there is something that exists, especially in plant populations, known as polyploidy. So when we looked at chromosomal mutations, you had something called aneuploidy, which is abnormal chromosome number. Now, when we put the word poly in front of here, poly means many. And so essentially polyploid is having whole extra sets. Okay, so if you think about humans, our haploid number was 23, our diploid number is 46. So polyploidy would be like having a whole extra set. Like you could have 69 chromosomes, or you could have 92 chromosomes, and that is having whole extra sets. So instead of just having one extra or two extras, you literally have extras of every single chromosome. And so this polyploidy in animals, like I said, is typically lethal, but in plants it often makes them bigger and better. In fact, many of the plants and fruits and vegetables that we see in a grocery store, a lot of times they are intentionally made polyploid because it makes them bigger and stronger and prettier. And so if this were to happen naturally, just due to mistakes with meiosis, then what can happen is we can have offspring that have a different number of chromosomes than the parents. And so for plants, one type of sympatric speciation is known as autopolyploidy. And I want you to relate this word here. Auto means self, okay? Like an autobiography is where somebody writes it themselves, okay? So auto means self. So autopolyploidy happens typically due to self-pollination. And so what can happen is an individual, just through errors in meiosis, through this self-pollination, they could produce offspring that have a completely different chromosome number. And if those offspring survive and are able to reproduce, if they were to self-pollinate, that they could then continue that new chromosome number. And it could get to the point where they no longer reproduce with the original. And so as soon as we have a new group with a new chromosome number that is going to be reproducing separately from the original, we technically now have two new species of plants. Now, there's another type of polyploidy known as allopolyploidy or allopolyploid. And this is where we have two different species. So allo, I think, means different, but so we have two different species that somehow, due to compatibility, once again, this is common in plants, even if they have different chromosome numbers from each other, if they are able to produce an offspring, that offspring a lot of times will have a unique chromosome number different from either group. So it essentially creates this hybrid plant, and then that hybrid plant could then carry on that new chromosome number. And so what can happen is we can get, once again, a new species of plant relatively quickly. So here you have some chromosomal errors. What happens is the gametes, you can see here, for whatever reason, those chromosomes were not separated properly. So we have two different species coming together, and then this hybrid, if it's able to survive, obviously it's going to create some unique gametes. And so over time, it could lead to a completely different chromosome set than either of the original species. And therefore, this particular plant group would now become their own species. So once again, two main types of speciation. Allopatric is due to a geographic isolation of some type, and sympatric is due to any other reason. And that could be because of something like a chromosomal difference due to some improper meiosis. Now, in general, speciation can occur anytime there's reproductive isolation. And so reproductive isolation is just something that's going to cause two groups within a species to either no longer mate, or if they do mate, they aren't able to produce viable offspring. And so this could take a long time, or this could happen in a few short generations like we saw with the plants. But reproductive isolation is just something that will prevent two populations from mating or producing offspring. And so, this is just kind of a silly example, but you could take this population of flies here, and if you kind of segregate them with different food sources over generations, if you were to mix them back together, they may no longer mate. Even though originally they could, over time these changes accumulated and they won't. Then reproductive isolation has occurred and speciation has now taken place. And so reproductive isolation can kind of happen in two different levels. We could have it either pre-zygotic or post-zygotic. And so let's just kind of clarify what these mean here. So a zygote is a fertilized egg. So when sperm meets egg, that produces that single cell known as the zygote. And so your pre-zygotic barriers would be something that would prevent mating, or it would prevent the fusion of the egg and the sperm. So for whatever reason, there was an issue before fertilization, or fertilization can't happen. Now, your post-zygotic barriers are things that are going to happen after. So you could potentially produce a zygote, but then there's some kind of breakdown after that point. So we're first going to take a look at some pre-zygotic barriers. And it could be something simple like they live in different habitats. You could have one population living in the top of the tree and one population living in the lower portion of the tree, and over time they may no longer mate. You could have something like they live on different islands, they were separated, or they live in different layers of the lake or the ocean. You know, anytime there's differences in habitat. Behavioral isolation has to do with mating signals. And so for whatever reason, there could come a point where if they no longer recognize the other groups, like mating calls or mating dance, then that could lead to the creation of a new species. I always give the example of frog calls because when I was in ecology in college, I had to learn frog calls. Like I had a cassette tape, that tells you how old I am. But I had a cassette tape and I would listen to frog calls at night, and I had to know which one was the green frog and which one was the leopard frog. And they definitely have distinctive calls. And so there's always two that kind of stood out to me. And one of them, my professor liked it. It was his favorite. He called it the donk donk frog because it made kind of this donk donk sound. And then there's another one that you hear pretty often around our area. If you have a pond or some kind of body of water near your home, when it's mating season, you probably hear these frogs that kind of sound like insects, but they kind of go meh. And so the whole concept behind that is that you would never have a meh frog mating with a donk donk frog because they just simply don't respond to that mating call. So even if they were physically capable of mating, if they don't recognize the mating signals, they're no longer going to reproduce together. It could be a temporal isolation, which is time. So maybe they have different mating seasons, maybe they have different mating times during the day, but for whatever reason, it's a time factor that could keep them from mating. It could be a mechanical isolation, and that just means you have a parts problem. Okay, they're anatomically incompatible. So in terms of sexual reproduction, the male part and the female part are not compatible. And so therefore they could not deposit the sperm inside of the female or something along those lines. And then the last type is gametic isolation. So maybe you could technically have a mating act. Sex could occur, but if the egg and sperm will not join up, then obviously that's going to be an issue pre-zygote. So this is where the egg and sperm aren't compatible. Now, these other barriers are things that could occur after the zygote is formed. So we have mating between two groups. We have the fusion of egg and sperm, but then something's going to happen after that. And so we can kind of break these down into viability, fertility, and hybrid breakdown. So hybrid is just a cross between two species, okay? So let's say that we had two groups. They were able to produce a zygote, but that zygote never completed development. We never actually got a baby or an offspring that survived. And so there's literally a breakdown that the zygote itself is not really viable. So we get the zygote, but it can't complete development. Then the next step is reduced hybrid fertility. And so we're probably kind of familiar. You might be familiar with this one. So this is where you can take two different species, you can cross them. You can get a baby, but the baby is sterile. And a very common example of that is a mule. And so when you cross the horse and the donkey and you get a mule, that mule is sterile. So they technically would not be considered their own species because they can't continue on and reproduce. And then you have hybrid breakdown. And so this is where the two groups are able to mate. They're able to produce a baby. The babies, though, are not... they're able to reproduce, but as we go through their generations, the offspring are becoming weaker. So I kind of like to remember that with viability, there's no baby. Okay, you get a zygote, but no baby. With fertility, you get a baby that can't have babies. And then you take it one step further with hybrid breakdown. So the babies can't have babies. And so it just takes it another generation further. And once again, when we're trying to, like, the whole point is trying to survive, pass on those traits, carry on those genes. If these babies are going to be infertile somewhere along the line, then we would not necessarily consider those two groups a solid species. Now, even though we may have speciation, and that may lead to two different species, it doesn't mean that they never interact, okay? If at one point they could mate and produce babies, then even after speciation, a lot of times they could still be able to meet up, mate, reproduce. And so these areas where they may overlap is called a hybrid zone. So it's not like as soon as speciation occurs, they never interact again. Okay, there could be these hybrid zones where they do continue to interact. Now, depending on what's going on with the hybrid zones and what's happening with their babies, there's kind of three main things that could happen. Okay, so if in these hybrid zones where they are mating and producing these hybrids, then if the hybrids are not very fit, that's going to reinforce speciation. So that's going to encourage them to continue to diverge, okay? And they will probably continue to be more different until they reach the point where they technically are two separate species completely, okay? So if the babies aren't any good, it's going to reinforce speciation. Now, if they are mating in a hybrid zone and these reproductive barriers that cause them to become two different species, then if that kind of weakens and those issues kind of go away, then they could actually fuse and they could actually become one species again. Right. And then sometimes you have a hybrid zone where the hybrid babies are fit, they're able to produce offspring, but you still have some of those barriers that prevent them coming back together as one. Then what can happen is you can continue living as two different species with stability within that hybrid zone. So if you have these hybrid zones where two species interact, if the babies aren't fit, it may reinforce that divergence or that speciation. If the babies are fit and those barriers kind of go away, they could actually become one species again. Or they could just maintain a stable hybrid zone where they still continue to interact, but they won't necessarily come back together. And so once again, this is just what's happening in these zones where species may still interact with each other. All right, now we're going to end our lesson with just a few other evolutionary patterns. And so these are some things that we can see along with speciation, kind of some large-scale evolution patterns. And so we're going to take a look at each one of these. We have adaptive radiation. And anytime you see the word radiation, I want you to think about the sun. And so we have this radiation, or these rays that are coming off of the sun. And the key to adaptive radiation is when one species gives rise to many, okay? So sometimes, especially after things like, a mass extinction, we can have rapid evolution. And I know this may not necessarily agree with some of your beliefs on origin, but, according to science, everything evolved from something else. And so if you look back at the evolutionary history of organisms, there have been many adaptive radiations. So like there would have had to have been the first fish, there would have had to have been the first mammal, there would have had to have been the first reptiles. And so when you look at all of your big major groups, they would have undergone some adaptive radiations where that original ancestor gave rise to many new ones. But the key to adaptive radiation is many are going to radiate from one. One gives rise to many. And probably one of the most common examples of this is Darwin's finches. So you would have had an original ancestral ground finch that, as they became isolated on different islands with different food sources, you have many different new species of finches that came from this original. So here we kind of see that sun pattern again. All right, the next kind of mechanism of evolution is something called coevolution. And think of co as together. Okay, coevolution is when two organisms or two species, really that should say species, or two populations, evolve in response to each other. And we see this a lot in those close relationships that we looked at back in ecology. We see this in things like predator-prey. As the prey evolves, so does the predator, or vice versa. We see this in relationships like parasite-host. As the parasite evolves, so does the host, or as the host evolves, so does the parasite. An example of that would be something like viruses. I know viruses aren't alive, but we see the evolution of viruses, and as our immunity changes, oftentimes the viruses or the bacteria will evolve to kind of outwit our immune systems, which is why we have so much trouble getting rid of them. We also see it in mutualistic relationships like pollinators and flowers. You know, as the pollen tubes vary or they change, so do the beak shapes. And so we see this a lot in those close relationships. So the evolution of one triggers the evolution of another. And so a lot of times I'll give an example of, let's say you have a grasshopper population that is feeding on a particular type of grass. Well, due to random mutation, some of these grasshoppers, or due to a random mutation, some of your grass produces this chemical that the grasshoppers don't like. And so over time, what would happen is that grass population that had that chemical, they're going to survive and reproduce more. And so as you see more and more of that chemical grass, there could be grasshoppers that are able to tolerate it. And so as the grass, you see more and more of that chemical, if there's any grasshoppers that are still able to eat that grass, then they will survive and reproduce more. So over time, the change in the grass can lead to the change in the grasshopper. So once again, coevolution, two species or two populations evolve in response to each other. The next one is convergent evolution. And convergent evolution is going to be the opposite of divergent. So divergent is when two populations become more different, okay? Convergent means to come together, and so convergent is where you have populations that become similar. Now, this is pretty important here. This is something you looked at in your evidence for evolution, but convergent evolution leads to analogous structures. So analogous structures are structures that are similar because of function or environmental pressure. All right, analogous structures are not a result of fitness, okay? So analogous structures are alike not because they're related, and I just said that wrong. Analogous structures are not alike because they're related. You have species of all different types that could have analogous structures, okay? So homologous structures that we looked at before, they are alike because they are related to each other, okay? Like the vertebrate wings or the vertebrate limbs. You see the same bone structure in a flipper and a wing and a hand and a cat paw, okay? So homologous structures are alike because there is a relationship. Analogous structures are alike because they're in the same places, they're under the same environmental pressures, they are doing the same things. All right, so here you have the body of a fish, a reptile, and a mammal. And you can see that they all kind of have this bullet type shape. That's going to help them move through the water. Okay, but this mammal is more related to me than it is to either of these. Okay, so the reason they look so much alike is because they're all three living in the water under the same pressures. Another example would be like coloration. You know, let's say you go to the desert. You find a lot of tan organisms. You can find tan spiders. You can find tan rodents. You can find tan reptiles like snakes. Well, why are they tan? They're all trying to blend in with the sand. Okay, so it's not because they're related to each other, it's because they're under the same pressures. So convergent evolution leads to similarities in organisms that are in the same environments, doing the same things, or under the same pressures. All right, and the last thing we're going to talk about is rate of speciation. And so evolution is not always slow. Okay, there are times when evolution is slow and steady. There's also times when evolution could occur rather quickly. And so these two examples are just some examples of how the rate of change can happen. So gradualism is just slow and steady. Okay, we see just kind of in the fossil record, we see examples of both of these. But this is where over time you see a slow and gradual change. Okay, So like in the case of humans, you could look at us in terms of height. There's kind of been a slow, gradual change to taller humans over time, okay? It didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen in 1 or 2 generations, but a slow and steady change. Now, punctuated equilibrium is where you have periods of stasis, which means pretty much there's not a lot of change. And then all of a sudden, you see an abrupt change, okay? So normally that's caused by some kind of major environmental change. So you have a population that's doing well, that's successful, it's moving right along, it's staying relatively the same. But then if you have a major change in the environment, maybe there was a major climate change, maybe there was some kind of natural disaster, maybe there was something like in the case of the asteroid that you're going to watch in the video. If it causes these major changes, it's pretty much adapt or die quickly. And so what can happen is in punctuated equilibrium, we see periods of, staying the same, and then they have rapid periods of change. So gradualism is slow and steady over long periods of time. And then punctuated equilibrium is you have stasis that is punctured by periods of change rather rapidly. And that is going to wrap up our macroevolution notes. Okay, so we have a pretty big unit once again. So macroevolution were these big changes, normally involving speciation. And so what you're going to be doing tomorrow is a review activity that kind of helps you go over several of these that we talked about today. When you take a quiz on this, guys, it's going to actually be on microevolution and macroevolution together. So you have a lot of vocabulary. I would definitely study for this one. Make sure you're familiar with the definitions and the examples. And then, of course, also know how those small changes occur, like natural selection, genetic drift, gene flow. And if you guys have any questions about anything, just let me know. Hopefully I'll get to see you soon. And I hope you guys have a great day.